What is the hardest game ever made? You would think this is an easy question to answer. Maybe you are expecting me to say something like, oh, it's easy, it's this one. But that couldn't be further from the case here. Truth is, this is a really difficult question to answer. So difficult, in fact, that we will have to clarify several things before I can give you an answer. And yes, I said an answer, not the answer. There are many caveats here, and even taking those into account, I am not 100% sure I have the right answer. I'm pretty confident, but I can't say it with absolute certainty. So, I hope you join me in this journey as we try to discover what is the hardest game ever made. What even is hard?
Hey,
what the fuck?
Michael here. Skeletons are scary.
The first problem we will run into when trying to answer this question is in the question itself. Hard, after all, is a very subjective and fittingly hard thing to define. I think a better word might be difficult, which is something that requires much effort or skill to accomplish. The problem we run into here is how do we categorize something as more difficult than anything else? After all, that is highly subjective. Something that is hard for you might be easy for someone else. The way I chose to get past this is quite simple. We will consider something to be harder if many people have attempted it, but either very few or none have ever accomplished it. Needless to say, this instantly disqualifies any FromSoft games since tons of people have beaten them, with only a single exception, that being Sekiro. Sekiro has no way around its difficulty. No summons, no broken builds, it's just you and the game mechanics. Even given all of this, Sekiro doesn't even come close to the level of difficulty we will talk about on this video. But this game does have an ace up its sleeve. Sekiro has a boss gauntlet mode that is decently challenging. Adding to this, Sekiro has a couple ways of pushing this challenge even further. The Demon Bell buffs every enemy in the game in pretty much all respects: health, posture, and damage. And this stacks with an additional debuff you can acquire. If at the start of the game you give Prince Kuro his charm back, you now receive damage from blocking, meaning you will always have to perfectly time your block to deflect enemy attacks if you want to avoid taking damage. Also, on top of this, enemy health and posture is further increased, and any status effects on you build up much faster. Adding to this, every time you beat the game, you start over in a new NG plus cycle that makes enemies even stronger. This stacks up to 7 times. Sadly, NG plus level does not affect Sekiro boss gauntlets, so Mortal Journey plus Bell plus no Kuro charm is as far as we can push this game's difficulty. But Sekiro relies on timing and mastery of its combat system for its difficulty. Desert Bus tries to outlast you instead. In this game, you drive a bus through the desert. There's no traffic, no turns, just a straight path ahead, you and your bus. The trip takes over 8 real-life hours, and you can't just tape down the accelerate button because the bus veers slightly to the right, which means you have to keep looking at it so you don't go off the road. If you do go off the road, you have to get towed back. And you do get towed back in real time. That means if you lose focus and veer off the road after 5 hours, then it takes 5 hours to get back to the starting point. But if you do make it through the 8-hour trip, you score 1 single point, and you are then prompted with a choice to make a return trip for a second point. You only have a few seconds to take the second trip. You cannot just stop there and go to sleep. There is no pause. Desert Bus cannot be beaten. It has no ending and is therefore disqualified. But what if we considered a single trip a victory? You win the game as long as you make it to Las Vegas once. Even then, it's disqualified because of tedium. Here is where the caveats I mentioned come in. It is certainly impossible to pick a hardest game if we do not set some clear boundaries first. And our first rule, tedium, disqualifies any game if most of the difficulty in them comes from having to do something for an unreasonable amount of time. Yes, this also means that all Gears of War games, which could be considered for their seriously line of achievements, which basically task you with grinding the game endlessly, are also disqualified, as well as Bladder of Steel from Rock Band 2, which tasks you with basically playing for 6 hours straight without failing songs or pausing the game. While this one requires some skill, the main difficulty component across all of these is tedium and endurance, which is not what I'm looking for when I'm talking about difficulty. But what about literally unobtainable achievements in video games? Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter, better known as categorize, has an achievement called World Champion, which is just topping the game's online leaderboard. This is ridiculous in its own right, but the game's servers are shut down, meaning no matter how hard you try, you simply cannot obtain this without cheating. The Stanley Parable is also home to some of gaming's most ridiculous achievements. One that I would like to highlight is Super Go Outside, which you get for playing the game, closing it, not playing for 10 years, and then opening it back up. Of course, this is disqualified for tedium, but kind of funny nonetheless. But the achievement I want to focus on is called Unachievable. No one knows how to get unachievable. You have to meet some requirements. We don't know what the requirements are, we just know they exist. And if you do, you have a 1 in 15 chance to get the achievement. The developer has admitted to patching this achievement to change the criteria you have to meet to qualify for it. So even if you did figure it out, it might change in the future. People eventually reversed engineer the game's code and figure out how to cheat the achievement, but this was clearly not intended, since this exploit was patched out of the game. A new workaround has been discovered, but I still consider it cheating. This means that Unachievable is one of the hardest achievements to get. Only very few people will ever get this achievement legitimately, which means the Stanley Parable is one of the hardest games ever made. The Stanley Parable is a completely challengeless game. It's an interactive story. It's not by a long shot the hardest game ever made, and one of the best arguments for why I won't consider tedium or flat out impossible achievements in my quest to find the hardest game. On the topic of which, come play this game with me. Visit the site onlinestopwatch.com. For real, just open a new tab if you're not watching this from your phone. Click here on stopwatch. Okay, the game consists on starting the stopwatch and pausing it at exactly 1 second. You will quickly notice this is extremely hard and will take many tries to get there. Now, to win my game, you have to hit stop exactly on every single second from 1 to 1000, without stopping for more than 1 second each time. The tedium rule does not apply to this, since it cannot take more than 34 minutes to complete, but nevertheless, this is humanly impossible. My point here is it's quite easy to come up with a game that is just not humanly possible, which again is not what I'm looking for when I'm asking the question, what is the hardest game? So anything impossible and humanly unachievable is out of the game. But what about League and Valorant and Dota and Apex Legends and Overwatch, Rock and Rainbow Six? Well, if we consider any competitive game, the goal is to win, which, considering modern matchmaking, is not difficult at all, since you will win roughly 50% of your games. But if we consider beating any of these games as being the number one player, then you could consider any and all of these games to be some of the hardest in the world. Anything with a competitive scene qualifies. League is the hardest game in the world, chess is the hardest game in the world, Super Mario 64 if you're speedrunning is the hardest game in the world. Any competitive endeavor can have one and only one best player, and it is incredibly challenging to get to that position. However, by this metric, it is impossible to qualify a hardest game among them all. When I ask what the hardest game is, I am never expecting a competitive game as a response. I already know being the best at any of these is extremely hard, and this is not an interesting response. For this reason, all competitive games, including speedruns, will not be considered. Mario Maker and Mario Maker 2 are games that let you design your own Mario levels. After you finish them, you can upload them and let other players play them. Of course, there's a virtually infinite number of levels uploaded, and as always, there's a masochistic subsection of players dedicated to make borderline impossible levels. You must, however, beat your own level before uploading it. While impossible levels can still be uploaded through non-intended means, most uploaded levels are humanly possible at the very least. However, we do run into a familiar problem here. The best Mario player in the world could upload a level only he could beat, and you could probably call that the hardest level of a game in the world, and therefore give Mario Maker the title of hardest game by proxy. There's just one issue, and that issue is called Geometry Dash. Geometry Dash is a really simple game. You're a cube and you tap to jump. That's it. There are some more game mechanics, but the only input required from the player is tapping. But even though all you can do is tap, when pushed to the limits, this game can be something else. This is Slaughterhouse. It is by all means considered impossible and was verified with cheats. However, after making the level slightly easier, it was finally beaten and thus verified by a human player. Remember my impossible game? The timer one? Yeah, that and this aren't all that far apart in difficulty. So, going back to Mario Maker. Which one of these stroke-inducing stages is harder? It is really quite impossible to tell. To be able to measure them up, you would need to be extremely proficient in both games, which is just ludicrous. Just like how hard it is to reach number 1 in ladder in a competitive game, this cannot be quantified. And that is why I chose to exclude any game that is made hard by including player-made levels. Yes, this also excludes Osu. So how about we now talk about Outer Wilds? No, this game isn't hard, it is completely irrelevant to this video. I mean, it's great and you should play it, but the reason I bring it up is Outer Wilds is the best example of a well-made puzzle game I've encountered so far. And sometimes it's hard to appreciate how hard it is to make puzzles that are both challenging and make sense. I want to put it in contrast with Takeshi's Challenge. This is a really obscure NES title and could be considered one of the hardest games in the world, because unless you Google what to do, it is borderline impossible. You will figure out the steps you need to take to beat Takeshi's Challenge. I will not spoil Outer Wilds. My point is you can tackle the world of Outer Wilds and explore all you want, in any order you want. And after all, you can still figure out what to do and where to go next, every step of the way. In contrast, here's how you beat Takeshi's Challenge. You ignore your boss screaming at you. This is so you can get fired later in the game. You head to the bank and close out your account and take out all of the money. Going to the culture club and learning to play the shamisen. Get wasted, pass out, be a victim of domestic abuse, divorce, do not do sexism, pay alimony, get fired. Then we head to the plant in the office to get some more money from the plant, learn how to hang glide, learn hentaboo, pachinko 500 balls, lose them all, buy a shamisen, karaoke, do a sexism, get a map from an old man, let the map soak in water, more than 5 minutes, no more than 10, cry into the microphone, beat up the old man, take the plane, exchange our currency, get ready for school, hang glide, sexism, play the magic Japanese guitar to escape, talk to the elder, get the rock, go into the cave, October,
The giant enemy spider.
get the treasure. And this is just mental. I'll leave a link to a JonTron video that goes more in depth about Takeshi's Challenge in the description if you're interested. Just know that this game does not follow any sort of sane logic. And I hope this helps you understand the problem with difficult puzzle games. You can make a puzzle game borderline impossible if it follows crazy moon logic, or no logic at all. I could call the password on my smartphone a puzzle game and challenge you to crack it, and it would probably be very challenging, but not really interesting. And for this reason, I decided to leave out puzzle games as well. Some of them might be hard, but only the stupid ones are hard enough to make it to the list anyways, so puzzle games are out. How about FTL, Faster Than Light? FTL is a game where you pilot a ship through space, fighting pirates, slavers, and rebels, while trying to escape the rebel flagship. This game is quite the challenge in easy difficulty. It is extremely hard in medium, and I don't personally know anyone who's ever beaten it in hard difficulty. FTL is a game about making choices, but don't be fooled. In FTL, RNG might end your run at any time, even if you make all the right choices. And here lies my main issue with FTL. No, not the RNG, but the game ultimately boils down to making the right choice every time. So once a single player has figured out the game and made the information public, then the game stops being hard and simply boils down to picking the correct option and waiting for RNG to be in your favor. For this reason, I believe FTL doesn't belong in my hardest games list, and neither do Slay the Spire, Monster Train, or any of the other turn-based games for the same reason. Enter the Gungeon is a top-down roguelike bullet hell. It starts off simple enough. You kill enemies, get guns and items, and kill bosses to progress to the next floor. And by the end it gets pretty nuts. The dragon final boss can be quite challenging, but that's nothing compared to the secret final boss, the Lich. After meeting certain conditions, you can gain access to Bullet Hell, the hardest level in the game, and at the end of it, the Lich is waiting for you. This is a brutal 3-phase boss fight that will truly test your mastery of this game, but it gets worse. The Glitch is an unlockable character. It is sort of an amalgam of all the other characters, and if you beat the Lich with the Glitch, instead of just winning normally, you start over a whole new run as the Gunslinger. If you ever die as the Gunslinger, to get another try at a Gunslinger run, you have to beat the whole game again as the Glitch. But if you manage to beat the Lich as the Glitch and go through the whole game as the Gunslinger, when you get to the Lich, you face the Glitch Lich instead. This boss is basically just 2 Liches at once. It's only phase 1, but this is frankly ridiculous and borderline impossible. You really need some decent RNG to get to this fight loaded to the teeth if you want to come out on top. But the Gungeon also holds tons of secret bosses, among which the hardest are the Rat and the Advanced Dragon. The Rat is quite hard to find, but if you get to it, you will be met with a very challenging 3-phase boss fight. Phase 1 and 2 are not easy by any means, but Phase 3 is a punch-out minigame that requires insane memorization of its patterns to beat. Fighting the Rat in this punch-out minigame rewards you with rat keys, which you can use to open 2 doors in a hidden room, which lead to a sleeping snake. If you feed the snake 4 of your items, it will follow you around. If you take the snake all the way to the dragon, after you beat it, it will consume the snake and turn into the Advanced Dragon. But none of this is what makes Enter the Gungeon incredibly hard. What makes the Gungeon a true challenge is actually hiding up here. These NPCs modify the game in some pretty nuts ways. Daisuke enables challenge mode. This means that every room that you enter in the Gungeon is affected by up to 3 random negative modifiers. Each one of these is awful and can make beating the game an absolute nightmare. On top of this, if you talk to Daisuke twice, you can enable double challenge mode, which adds even more modifiers per room. The sorceress essentially randomizes your weapon every few seconds. Tonic makes the game about 40% faster, which for a bullet hell game is just totally insane. And here's Bowler. He just gives you a free rainbow chest at the start of each level, which gives you a choice of 1 out of 8 items, but in exchange, you can't open any normal chests during your run. This means you will get fewer items during your run, but the items you do get tend to be way higher quality. Does Bowler make runs harder or easier? I'm not absolutely sure, but I personally think it makes them easier. So this is the only modifier we will not turn on for our ultimate challenge, which would be this: double challenge mode, turbo randomizer run, and you play as the glitch, effectively meaning you have to beat the game with all of this twice in a row. We of course fight all the optional bosses, including the rat, and pick up the snake to fight the advanced dragon both times. And this is probably the hardest the dungeon can get. But the real reason I mentioned Enter the Gungeon is because there's an item in the game so broken it turns any run into a joke. And that is the Super Hot Watch. This item effect is simple. Time only moves when you move. As long as you stand still, the game moves at 1/60th the normal speed. And this stacks. So if you get 2 of them, the game runs at 1/3600th the normal speed. This item literally breaks the game. If you wanted to beat the ultimate gungeon challenge I described earlier, this item would make it several orders of magnitude easier. And resetting until you get the watch is a perfectly valid strategy to beat the challenge. This actually means the gungeon can't actually compete with other games difficulty-wise, unless we say that you have to beat the challenge without ever picking up the Super Hot Watch. And that is our last rule: self-imposed challenges. Any game can be infinitely hard if we impose random restrictions to make it harder. Be it blindfolding or playing with a Fisher-Price steering wheel, any random challenge you can think of. Yoshi's Epic Yarn is by no means a difficult game, but I would struggle not to call it the hardest game ever if you're trying to beat it while doing a handstand with your head underwater and spinning plates on your feet. For this reason, we will only consider the hardest challenge the game can offer without imposing additional restrictions. And that's it. That's our final rule. And there's just one last thing to get out of the way before we talk about the hardest games I could find. Elden Ring, despite its reputation, it's very easy to beat. You can get a broken build, some summons, and just breeze through the game, kill the big purple lizard, and get to credits. But Malenia, particularly if your summons aren't that good at the game, is actually quite challenging. So is Elden Ring easy because it's easy to get to the ending cutscene? Or is Elden Ring a bit higher up because an optional boss is harder than the rest of the game? Or maybe it's somewhere in the middle. To avoid confusion, we will call just getting to credits any percent. And the path I chose to pick for my hardest games on this list is the latter. We are considering the hardest challenge the game has to offer. This means that when we consider a game, we're thinking about the game in its hardest difficulty and with all difficulty modifiers enabled if the game has them. That is to say, we will consider a game to be as hard as its hardest possible challenge. So, for example, if we considered Halo, that would be highest difficulty and all negative skulls turned on. Of course, we're doing this while respecting the rules we've set. So, no mods, for example, or no playing with a USB steering wheel, or with your head underwater, unless the game has a specific challenge designed for it. We would not consider a deathless run in Dark Souls 3, since it is something that you can do if you want, but you're self-imposing it. But we would count it in Dark Souls 2, because there's a ring that you get for doing that in Dark Souls 2. And therefore, to complete the whole game and get all items, including the rings, you must beat the game deathless, so that counts towards Dark Souls 2 difficulty. We will be answering the question of what is the game with the hardest challenge? That is the point of the video. But then, what is the hardest any percent game? Well, this isn't our main focus, but I don't want to leave you in the dark on this. So, of course, when asking what is the hardest game to beat, any game with a difficulty option is instantly disqualified. With that being said, let's talk about old NES games and masochism games. In the old NES games front, we have contenders such as Ninja Gaiden, Battletoads, Contra, Ghosts and Goblins, and Silver Surfer. And in the masochism front, we have stuff like Getting Over It, Jump King, I Wanna Be the Guy, Alt F4, and Pogo Stuck. The masochism side is weaker here, in my opinion. While games like Getting Over It and Jump King are specifically designed to be frustrating, after you beat these games for the first time, you start realizing that they are not as hard as they seem. The main challenge in these kind of games is just not to rage quit before you get to figure out how to actually play them. But once you do, they are truly not that bad. Don't get me wrong, most of these games are more than the average player can handle, but most dedicated players should not have that much trouble beating most of these. The NES side is a bit tougher. Some of these games are unforgiving and will truly test most dedicated players' patience. But all in all, I don't really have a very obvious contender for first place here. To have a first place with any degree of certainty, I would have to play and beat all of these games. And if I did that, this video will probably never be done. So for now, let's just say that the stronger contender in the masochism front is I Wanna Be the Guy, and the strongest contender on the NES side is Silver Surfer. We will call it a two-way tie. So the hardest game, any percent, is, if I didn't miss anything, probably one of these two. And that's it. That's all the caveats and details. Let's get into the hardest games I could find. These are not in any particular order, and there are probably some games I neglect to mention, since I haven't played every single game that exists. The only one I am quite really confident on is my number one pick. So, without further ado, Dead Cells is a roguelike, action, souls-like, dungeon explorer kind of game. And yes, Dead Cells is not that hard, and probably anyone can beat it, but as you beat it, you can add more boss stem cells, which further increase difficulty, and at 5, which is the maximum, the difficulty is actually quite considerable. On top of that, if you beat the game with 5 boss stem cells, you can fight the true final boss of the game, the Collector, which is quite a challenge. And recently they added a new boss rush mode that I haven't checked out, so I can't really speak for it right now. But even then, this is nothing compared to the games that are coming up next. But it is just hard enough that I thought it deserved a mention. Trails Fusion is a deceptively simple game. Just a racing game with some platforming thrown in. But as you get to the later tracks, you realize this is actually a hardcore platformer. This game is not about speed anymore, it's about making it to the end goal. The extreme tracks are already a challenge that will break most players. You get 500 mistakes before you have to restart each track from the beginning, which do go by surprisingly fast, but that's nothing compared to this game's ultimate challenge, ninja tracks. Ninja tracks are hidden. The first step to access them is to beat an extreme track flawlessly. Now, I'm going to repeat myself just to emphasize how hard this is. Most players will seriously struggle beating extreme tracks with 500 mistakes at their disposal. The first step to enter a ninja track is to beat one of these without any mistakes. Alright, you beat the track flawlessly and are at the end of the track. Now, you must let go of your bike in a leap of faith, hoping you land into the secret portal that should be open at the end of the level, and here you are, the ninja track. Now, if you made it here, the same rules as any extreme track apply. You must beat it within 500 mistakes, otherwise, you must get back in. That means beating the extreme track flawlessly again, and getting into the portal again for your second try at this. The hardest ninja track is currently Inferno 4. Just getting into Ninja Inferno 4 is a huge obstacle. Some people have beaten this, not many. This could be due to the game being quite obscure and not having a huge player base, and for that reason I seriously struggled to find footage for this game. However, this doesn't even come close to Hollow Knight. Again, just like many games before, pretty much anyone can beat Hollow Knight. And you should, it's a great game. But not anyone can truly beat every challenge in Hollow Knight. I would say Hollow Knight is quite an easy game for the most part. There is some challenge in some optional areas in the later stages of the game, like the Path of Pain. But when the Godmaster DLC released, this DLC added one of the hardest challenges in gaming history to this game, and that is the Pantheons. Pantheons start easy enough, with the Pantheon of the Master. In this Pantheon, you fight 9 bosses in a row. If you can get through all of them without dying, you fight a new boss, brothers Oro and Mado. This is a really hard fight to figure out on the fly, which means you will probably die and have to clear the whole Pantheon again to get another shot at fighting the brothers, but Team Cherry are merciful developers, so they added a place where you can fight any single boss you have previously seen. So if you get to them on the Pantheon, you can come in here and fight them over and over to get ready for the real thing. But once you beat the first Pantheon, there's more. Pantheon 2, the Pantheon of the Artist, has you fight another 9 bosses in a row. Harder bosses than the previous Pantheon 2, but get through them all and you can face Paint Master Shio. And when, after enough practice, you manage to defeat Shio, then comes Pantheon 3, Pantheon of the Sage. Here, there's a very significant difficulty spike. The 9 bosses of this Pantheon are all considerably harder than the last, and the last boss is quite tricky as well, Great Nail Sage Sly. But when you're done with him, Pantheon 4, the Pantheon of the Night, will truly test your mastery of the game. These 9 bosses you are required to defeat include 2 of my personally most hated bosses in any game, Markoth and No Eyes, as well as some other potential run-enders like White Defender. But if you get through them all, you fight the Pure Vessel, a buffed up version of the original final boss of the game. But if you take him down, you can finally face the final challenge in Hollow Knight, the Pantheon of Hallownest. Now, this Pantheon is nothing like the others. This Pantheon is truly something else. But before we talk about it, let's talk about the Hall of Gods, the practice area I mentioned before. When you first come here to practice, you might notice that you can pick from 3 different difficulties on each boss: Attuned, Ascended, and Radiant. In Attuned, you're just fighting the boss, normally, just a practice mode you would expect. In Ascended, the boss deals double damage, has increased health, and for many of the available bosses, comes with new moves or stage hazards. The Grass Mother, for example, now takes place on platforms. Keep in mind, this is on top of them dealing double damage and having more health. Radiant is quite simple. All additional hazards from Attuned are still there, but you die in a single hit. When you approach this tablet, you will realize it keeps track of all the bosses and what difficulty you've completed them in. And yes, to completely beat the game, you would need to fill this out, which I am quite proud to say I have done. And yes, despite it being quite a challenge, it is not actually that bad. To get to the bad part, we will now dive into the Pantheon of Hallownest. The Pantheon of Hallownest is a 42 boss gauntlet. Yes, 42. If you die at any point, you start again from the very first one. And of course, all the nightmarishly difficult ones are at the very end. Markoth, Grey Prince Sode, No Eyes, Nightmare King Grim, the Pure Vessel, and all of them have their ascended difficulty extra hazards on. Not the extra damage or increased health, mind you, but the arena or boss behavior changes that make the bosses substantially different and substantially more difficult. If you make it through all 41 bosses, if you survive the whole gauntlet, you get to fight the true final boss of the game. The Absolute Radiance. It is extremely long since it has a lot of health and is very hard to hit, and it deals double damage. You will probably die to the Absolute Radiance the first time you fight it, but that will unlock her in the Hall of Gods, which means you get to practice. But it also means you have to defeat her in Radiant difficulty to complete the Hall of Gods, which will be by far the biggest hurdle to complete the Hall of Gods. If you someday, like me, manage to beat the Pantheon of Hallownest, you will be among the few who can say they truly beat Hollow Knight all the way through. Is what I would say if there wasn't one more thing to this. And Yes, of course, there is more. Just a bit of foreshadowing here, but if I am capable of beating a challenge, it probably doesn't belong on this list. Each pantheon has a set of conditions you can apply to them. First is the nail binding. This just reduces your damage by almost 30%, making every single fight considerably longer. Then you have shell binding, reducing your health by more than half, leaving you with a measly 4 masks, meaning the radiance would kill you in just 2 hits. Third, and probably the worst out of all of them, is the charms binding. Charms are equipable items that give you access to buffs and abilities. You can have several of them equipped at a time, granting you very considerable advantages. Charms binding unequips all of your charms and makes it impossible to equip them back during the Pantheon. And lastly, the fourth binding, soul binding. Soul binding limits the amount of soul you can store to a single charge, meaning that at any time you can cast one single spell or heal one single mask before you will need to recharge your soul. This requires you to change the way you play drastically if you want to deal optimal damage to keep the fights as short as possible. And of course, these can all be active at once and can be applied to every single Pantheon. The hardest challenge in Hollow Knight is the Pantheon of Hallownest, Allbinds. Whenever you beat a Pantheon with Allbinds active, you get these shining symbols up there to showcase your achievement. I have beaten the first 2 Allbind Pantheons, but Pantheon 3 has been quite the wall for me. The Pantheon of Hallownest Allbinds is probably out of my reach. Quite a few people have managed to beat it though. Still, Hollow Knight is not as hard as Celeste. Celeste is by no means easy. Most of the harder stuff is optional, but even then, this game should provide a decently entertaining challenge to most people. But if you go out of your way to try to fully complete the game, you will most likely find out you are just not good enough to do it. While you play Celeste, you will realize there are many secrets and optional challenges. You can try to find and collect all berries for each level, find all the tapes to unlock the V-sides, and then all the C-sides, but all of these challenges pale in comparison to Celeste's final level, Farewell. Farewell is the last chapter to the game, and it is just insane to describe how incredibly hard this level is. If you ignored all secrets, Farewell is 100 screens long. This chapter forces you to learn techniques that were previously only used by speedrunners, like wave dashing. The level of mastery that you need over this game to beat Farewell is hard to describe, but with enough dedication, you can probably eventually beat it, as I have. And just like I said before, if I have completed a challenge in a game, it probably means there's much more to it than I've mentioned. If you decide to go to a previously beaten level in Celeste, you might notice there's a golden berry at the start of the level now. To earn this golden berry, you must beat the level again, but if you die at any point, you will go all the way back to the start of the level. Yes, some of these berries are quite challenging, but there are very few who can actually get Farewell's golden berry.
So few, in fact, that someone is hosting a list of all players confirmed to have earned Farewell's golden berry.
Getting through Farewell alone is already incredibly hard. It will take thousands of deaths to clear. Even on a second and third attempt, you have to get so ridiculously good at this game to not fail a single jump in order to get this berry. It's not even funny. And the first person to ever achieve this was Lenny Gold.
By some insane stroke of luck, I happened to be friends with Lenny, and I told him about this video. I just had one question for him. What is the hardest thing you have achieved in a video game? Keep in mind, this madman not only was the first person to ever achieve Farewell's golden berry, but he also did Allbind's Pantheon of Hallownest. His answer was actually quite interesting. He talked about 2 games. The first one is so obscure and I think it is so interesting. I'm actually planning to make a whole video about it soon, so we will just not talk about it right now. And the second one is Wings of Vi. According to Lenny, very few people have ever beaten this game in its hardest difficulty, and there is no record of anyone ever beating this game with all negative modifiers on. These modifiers are YOLO, which gives you 4 times the normal amount of health, but removes every single checkpoint in the game.
Meaning, if you die, you start the game all over again, from the very beginning.
Doomed, which makes you die in a single hit, effectively negating the extra health from YOLO. Turbo, which makes the game 25% faster. And Mirror, which just mirrors the screen.
This basically does nothing, though, so you could consider it optional.
The last modifier is Purified, which instantly unlocks every single weapon. And since it is an advantage, this should obviously be turned off.
Taking on this challenge means setting out on an over 2-hour journey of absolutely perfect play. And keep in mind that in demon runs, without any modifiers, death counts in the tens of thousands are very common.
If you're insane enough to want to be the first one to ever accomplish this, I'd encourage you to give it a shot, if you think you can manage it. But if, just like me, you don't want to subject yourself to this kind of torture, but you do enjoy seeing people attempt borderline impossible things, I do recommend following Lenny on Twitch, and if you're not one to watch live streams, he has a YouTube channel as well,
which you can find in the description. Hades. In this game, similar to what we've seen before, you pop into a room and you must kill every single enemy to advance. Before you do, you get a reward. Sometimes it's a boon from a god or weapon upgrade, which lets you pick one of 3 options that enhances your basic abilities. Some other times it's currency. As in any other roguelike, death means starting over from square one. As you progress, you get stronger, but so do your enemies, until you finally face the final boss of Hades. The king of Hades, Hades. Once again, don't let the mention of this game deter you from playing it. Anyone can beat Hades with enough practice, and just like many titles previously mentioned, the real challenge is optional and is waiting at the very end. So let's turn up the heat. Once you've already beaten the game, you unlock the Pact of Punishment, or Heat Gauge. If you want to keep upgrading your weapons, before you venture out into the underworld, you must now choose some penalties, which will make the game slightly harder than before. The game doesn't push you to pick many of them right off the bat, but eventually you will be making the game substantially harder as you try to pick the easiest to deal with penalties from the list. Well, you probably see where this is going. What if you maxed out every single one of these? Then you would be facing the legendary 63 heat run. But just because, if you start the game in hell mode, you add an extra modifier, which removes your short invulnerability after getting hit, for a grand total of 64 heat. Since there's a lot of modifiers, I will cover them quickly and give you a short rundown of just how hard this game can get. We have Hard Labor. All enemies deal double damage. Lasting Consequences. You cannot heal, meaning all damage you take is permanent. Convenience Fee. All shop prices are increased by 80%. Jury Summons. There's 60% more enemies. Extreme Measures. All the bosses in the game get extra abilities. Some extra health and damage too. And the final boss gets a whole extra face. Calisthenics Program. All enemies have 30% higher health. Benefits Package. All elite enemies have 2 random perks. Middle management, every mini-boss either spawns an additional elite or has some other extra difficulty. Underworld customs. Every time you clear a level, you have to get rid of one of your boons to move forward. Forced overtime. All enemies move and attack 40% faster. Heightened security. All traps in magma deal 4 times normal damage. Routine inspection. All your permanent upgrade talents are deactivated. Damage control. Every single enemy in the game is invulnerable to the first 2 instances of damage they take. Approval process. You don't get to choose from the normal 3 options when you pick up a boon. You just get 1 at random, which destroys your ability to make good builds consistently. And finally, and worst of all, tight deadline. You only have 5 minutes to clear each level in the game. If your time runs out, you start taking constant damage until you die. Now, without tight deadline, this wouldn't be that bad. You could just play it very safe, take it very slow, and you could probably eventually clear. The problem is, tight deadline means you can't afford to take things slow, because if you do, you will die. Yeah, that's quite a lot. So let's do some rule checks. Is this even possible? Surprisingly, yes. At this point, as far as I know, only 3 people have ever been able to beat this. But there's a catch. The only way anyone has beaten this is either with mods that guarantee you will get specific boons, or with a seeded run. Basically, if you choose to restart your run, your RNG doesn't reset. You will be offered all the same choices, and if you happen to hit the lottery on your boons, you could just retry that seed over and over until you beat it. Halion has an excellent video on why no one will ever be able to beat this game at max heat, which will be linked in the description, and it all comes down to RNG. Basically, to beat this challenge, you need a very specific build. You need to take the shield with aspect of Zeus, which will make your special follow you around dealing damage. Then you need Thunder Flourish, which has a really broken interaction with the shield that makes it deal a lot of consistent damage. And Explosive Return, which adds some more high base damage and AoE. But why? Why this specific build? Why is no other build viable? Why are all other weapons not even considered? Despite having played the game a fair bit myself, High Heat Hades is a completely different game from what casuals like me delve in. And if I wanted to know, I was going to have to dig a bit deeper. I quickly found Seagull's channel and came across this video in which he says he routed this run, which is using RNG manipulation to get the boons you need. After watching some of his videos, I tried reaching out, and while he didn't have all the answers I was looking for, he pointed me to the Hades speedrunning Discord, and there, Angelic, one of the 3 people who beaten modded 64 Heat, gave me the answers I was looking for. The reason the only viable weapon is shield is quite obvious in hindsight. It's because you can block. With so many enemies that are so resilient and so fast, considering all the damage you take is permanent, being able to block attacks with shield charge, which also doubles as mobility and damage, is the only consistent way to survive. And the reason you need those specific boons is because if you don't get them, you just won't have enough damage to make the timer. But how did they reach this conclusion? Was every other build extensively tested? Well, yes. Angelic has tested basically every build, and nothing besides Zeus Shield has worked consistently. She's gotten close with Zag's Shield, but nothing seems to work as well as the current known setup. Of course, other builds are capable of clearing, but to beat this realistically, you need to get them consistently, and the Zeus Shield only requires about 4 specific boons to work, while others require around 7, which means the chances to get them decrease exponentially. So with this information, knowing that you need 4 very specific upgrades to beat the game. Doesn't this game fall under the tedium rule? Isn't the main challenge of the game just the mindless grind of restarting to get the right boons? Well, no. This challenge is so insane that the main part of the challenge actually comes after getting the good RNG. Even with mods that guarantee the right boons, only 3 people have been able to beat this. On top of this, the chances of getting a viable run should be around 1 in 500, which, while extremely unlikely, isn't unheard of. And this would be where the Hades story ends. Except, when I went on the Discord, Angelic started doing attempts. Unmodded, unseeded attempts. And just moments later, everything lined up. Epic Thunder Flourish, Explosive Return, Epic Static Discharge. And just like that, she was the first person to ever complete Hades 64 Heat. Meaning she has truly beaten Hades. Which is definitely one of the hardest games ever made. And we've almost made it to the end. There's just one more game to talk about before we get to the hardest game ever made. Halo 2. We won't delve too deep into this one. Most people already know how this played out, but I'll give you a short summary. Charlie, Moist Critical, made a video setting a $20,000 bounty for anyone who could beat Halo 2 in its hardest difficulty, with all negative skulls turned on, which are basically modifiers. As far as I know, the only person to ever achieve this is Gerbilin, who won the 20 grand after completing the challenge live, and you can watch his whole run in the link in the description. Halo 2 is another extremely strong contender for the hardest game ever made. It fits snugly under all the criteria we've set, and could definitely be the hardest game ever made, if it wasn't for. Crypt of the Necrodancer. Crypt of the Necrodancer is a rhythm-based roguelike game that plays like bullet chess on speed. Since I find the nature of these games' challenges fascinating, we will do a deep dive on this one, so you can really understand how hard this game truly gets. This game has a unique mechanic. You can only move to the beat of the music. If you try to move freely, you would end up just not moving most of the time. The first thing you should do when you start playing Crypt is clear each of its 4 levels, or zones, individually. Each level has 3 floors. Each floor contains a mini-boss that you must defeat before the song ends to move forward. If the song ends without you having killed the boss, you will start the next level locked in with several bosses, which is almost certainly a death sentence. Then, at the end of the 3 floors, you fight a main boss. Once you've cleared all 4 zones, you will hit your first difficulty wall, All Zones mode. This is where the actual game begins. You start off with all the permanent upgrades you would be allowed to use in individual levels disabled. No extra health, no starting equipment. Your objective is to beat all 4 zones in a row, all 12 floors, plus 4 main bosses. And at the very end, you face the final 2 bosses of the All Zones run. But before we move forward, let's talk about the combat of Crypt of the Necrodancer. Earlier, I compared this game to chess, and that's because this game really does feel a bit like real-time chess. The way this game works gives it almost a turn-based game feel, in which every single beat you take a turn. But just like in chess, some positions are so complicated, with so many enemies on screen, which all do so many different things, that finding the right move will require you to think several moves ahead. And unlike chess, you have less than 1 second to make your move. Let's talk about some of the enemies. Each one of them has a certain move and attack pattern. They all follow pretty simple rules. The green slime just stands there, jumping in place. It's actually so hard to get killed by this, it's an achievement. Blue slimes move back and forth between 2 tiles every other beat, and skeletons jump towards you every other beat. Easy, right? Well, as we move through the levels, things are about to get a lot more complicated. In Zone 2, you face armadillos that start rolling towards you every single beat in an invulnerable state. only becoming vulnerable to damage after they collide with something. And skeleton mages will pull you in with wind spells. In Zone 3, goblins will chase you around as long as you're not looking to fight them. If you try to fight back, they will run away from you, until you start running away from them again. Fire and ice beetles will chase you around while immune to damage until they're right next to you. But the main hazard in Zone 3 are the special floor tiles. In addition to the normal traps in Zone 2, Zone 3 has ice tiles and fire tiles. Ice tiles will cause you to slip to the next tile, and these chain together, making you slide over to your death very often. Fire tiles will damage you if you stand on them for any longer than a single beat, meaning digging, attacking, or failing to move will damage you. And these are everywhere. Zone 4 is truly awful. These Blade Masters will move at you every single beat in any direction, and they're immune to damage until they are right next to you. When they are, you must hit them and then they will parry your attack and then lunge at you. After you dodge the lunge, this is your one chance to hit back before they become invulnerable again. There's also harpies that can leap over enemies and move 3 tiles every other beat, and magic monkeys that will teleport you to a random spot in the dungeon, basically guaranteeing your death. On top of this, Zone 4 has sarcophaguses that constantly spawn enemies, and you have to kill the sarcophagus in addition to the mini-boss to be able to leave the floor. Zone 4 also has a grid-like structure composed of cells filled with enemies. Whenever you dig a wall, all adjacent walls will crumble, prompting you to deal with all the enemies contained within the cell at once. But if you do get through all this in a single run, you face the Dead Ringer and finally the Necrodancer. I might have made this sound extremely challenging so far, and to be fair, it's not easy, but it is only the very tip of the Necrodancer iceberg. Now that you understand the basics of the game, let's dive deeper into the grid. All Zones is by no means easy. I was already over 40 hours into the game when I managed to get my first clear. Despite of the insane difficulty of the game, as in any other roguelike, you will acquire several items and weapons that will really help a lot in taking down the challenges the game throws at you. As long as you're dealing at least 3 damage per hit and have a decent amount of armor and health, and most importantly, have at least 2 range. Seriously, you want to get rid of your dagger as soon as possible. It is by far the worst weapon in the game. But as long as you do, All Zones is not all that bad. And with a bit of luck, it might take some time, but it is definitely achievable for any player. The problems begin when you look at the characters menu. Crypt has several different characters to choose from. They all change how you play drastically, and some of them push the difficulty of this game to the very edges of human capability. Cadence is the vanilla character of the game. Melody can only use the golden loot as a weapon. It has 1 range, which isn't great, but it damages all enemies around you whenever you move. This locks you to a weapon that is inferior to most ranged weapons, but still vastly superior to the starting dagger. Bard is the only character that actually makes the game easier. With Bard, enemies only move when you move, turning the game into an actual turn-based game. Of course, beating the game as Bard is an absolute joke. Eli could be considered easier than Cadence. He can't use conventional weapons, he instead has infinite bombs that he can push around to deal with enemies, which are harder to use, but a lot more powerful than most weapons. Moving up slightly in difficulty, Dorian can only move 2 tiles at a time. This is incredibly annoying, but with slow and careful play, this is not too hard to get around. And now for the really challenging characters. Most people will just never be able to clear the game as any of these. Bolt. Bolt doubles the game's speed. Yeah, some of the previous examples of games getting faster go 25% faster, like Wings of Bye, or 40% faster, like Enter the Gungeon. Crypt goes 100% faster. And keep in mind, this is a huge deal in Crypt, since the game speed radically affects your ability to make decisions, and at this point starts truly testing your ability to keep up with the beats. Always keep in mind, Crypt is not at all a slow game when not playing as Bolt. And just to drive this point home, here's Death Metal, the boss with the fastest song in the game, played with Bolt. Dove is the pacifist version of Crypt. She can't kill any enemies at all. This will very often lead you to getting swarmed and killed. Dove is extremely RNG heavy, since starting enemy position and level layout can give you a free run or an almost impossible run. Monk is quite straightforward. Picking up any gold instantly kills you. Since most enemies in the game drop gold when killed, Monk has to constantly herd mobs to kill them in specific places in order to build a gold maze that leaves him enough space to maneuver, attack, and evade enemies as needed without stepping on any of the gold that's on the floor. As if this wasn't bad enough, enemies that would normally not drop any gold drop gold only when playing as Monk. Most players will give up on Monk really quickly after realizing that after playing for as long as one has to play to even consider doing a Monk run, picking up gold is so habitual, so ingrained in your muscle memory, that it will take tens of hours to stop dying to just forgetting you shouldn't pick up gold. And last is Arya. Arya only has half a heart of health, which cannot be upgraded, meaning any hit from any enemy will instantly kill you. This is already pretty hard in its own right, but that's not where this challenge stops. Arya is also locked to the dagger, the absolute worst weapon in the game. The main reason the dagger sucks is its range. You must put yourself right next to your enemy to deal damage with the dagger, which makes it that much more likely that you'll mess up and get hit. Pairing that with a character that dies in a single hit is masochistic. But the funny part is that that's not all Arya does. And actually, I haven't even mentioned the worst part. Arya takes damage from missing beats. The character that dies in a single hit takes damage from missing a single beat. This means that Arya will die from any single mistake you make, no matter how small. Well, you do start with a potion that will save your life one single time, and you could get glass armor, which would give you one additional mistake, but still, beating the game as Arya requires absolute mastery of this game. Arya is the equivalent of a perfect no-hit run in Crypt. One extra detail about Arya is that she plays the game backwards, but to be honest, I don't really think this is such a huge negative. It might actually be better to get the worst out of the way first, but this also means you have to clear the hardest parts of the game without having picked up any items yet, which, despite most items not being useful for Arya, some of them can really save your life and make a run so much easier. It really is hard to put into words how insane of a challenge Arya is. The level of strategic planning at ridiculous speeds required to beat the game as Arya are absolute nonsense. But of course, Crypt wouldn't be worthy of the title hardest game ever made if this was all it had to offer. Of course not. We're not even halfway through. If you somehow happen to be able to complete the game as Arya, your next challenge should be to complete an all characters run. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's a special type of run in which you have to beat all zones as every character I just mentioned in a row without dying once. Thankfully, the game does let you pick the order of the characters, so if you were to attempt this madness, you should probably do Dove first, since she's the most RNG heavy character, then clear out Monk, Arya, and Bolt, and at that point the challenge should be basically complete. If you happen to clear all characters, if you can beat 9 runs in a row without dying, if you're the kind of person that can push through such an absurd and frankly tortuous challenge, you will have finally earned the right to play the hardest character in the game, Coda. Coda is truly nightmarish. Coda has every single Arya modifier, so right off the bat, he is locked to a single hit death and will die on any missed beats. And of course, he can only use the dagger, the worst weapon in the game. In addition, he has the monk modifier, meaning that he also dies if he touches gold, adding such a huge layer of complexity to Arya that at this point means that bad level layouts are basically impossible to clear, and planning very far ahead is now an absolute requirement, not only to avoid the regular hazards and enemies, not only to make sure you can always take action every single beat so you don't die from missing one, but also so you kill enemies in specific spots so you can make it to the exit without stepping on any of the gold piles. That would be bad enough, but Coda also has the bolt modifier. Yes, Coda plays the game at double speed, not missing a single beat or making any missteps while hurting monsters without getting hit ever, so you can kill them on specific spots to make a gold mace so you can leave the level at double speed. Very few people have ever beaten this game as Coda, and if you're one of the very few who can manage this challenge, you can now say you've done something that most people would truly never be capable of. Thankfully, if you got this far, your next step I would barely consider a step up in difficulty. Your next step forward is all characters low percent. As mentioned, all characters runs do not include Coda, but what is low percent? A low percent clear means you cannot ever pick up any items. This means any items that might give you extra health or extra hits. Even with Arya, you wouldn't be able to pick up glass armor, heavy glass armor, or potions. Any kind of weapon or spell or healing item on any character, anything you pick up will instantly kill you. This makes characters like Monk, with its very low starting HP of 2, and of course his dagger starter weapon, that much harder. And you do have to clear the game with all 9 characters to claim victory. If you happen to somehow beat all characters low percent, you will have earned what is probably the hardest game achievement in history. Lowest of the low. But there's a catch. You see, through all of this, I haven't mentioned that in 2017, Crypt got a DLC called Amplified. This added a DLC all characters mode with 13 characters instead of 9. While this might sound terrible, none of the 4 added characters stuck up to Monk or Dove or Arya in difficulty. So while this is obviously harder than the pre-DLC 9 characters, it shouldn't prove impossible for someone who managed to beat regular all characters low percent before. But this isn't the main issue added with the DLC. The main issue is Zone 5. The DLC added a whole new zone to the game. This means that for every single previous challenge I mentioned, there's a whole new zone to get through, with all 3 floors and a boss at the end. While Zone 5 is not necessarily harder than Zone 4, having 3 extra floors and 1 extra boss per character, plus adding 4 more characters to the all characters run on top, makes it so much more likely that you will get unlucky or slip up and end your whole run. A Coda clear with all 5 zones is an achievement that even fewer people can claim, and same goes for lowest of the low with DLC characters and all 5 zones. But of course, with Crypt of the Necrodancer, it doesn't just end here. Welcome to the ultimate challenge in Crypt of the Necrodancer, and probably the hardest challenge ever made in any video game ever. This is Crypt's extra mode room. All these altars act as modifiers, and of course, most of these stack. First up is the dance pad mode. This just makes the game easier in case you want to play with the dance pad. Neat, but we don't really care about it. Story mode is like all characters, but only includes cadence, melody, and aria, so we don't really care about it either. All characters we've already discussed at length. As well as all characters amplified. Only one of these three can be active at once, and of course, we would want either all characters amplified for a total of 13 successful successive runs, or a single coda run, whichever is harder. The ensemble shrine makes you switch to a random character every single floor. This cannot be active with all characters amplified, but either way, in all likelihood, just makes the game easier anyways. So we would have kept this off regardless. Deathless mode is basically high score mode, in which every time you clear you get a point and you see how high you can go before dying. But we don't really care about this one since doing a single run is probably impossible. We will activate no return mode. This makes it so that if we move back to the tile we were previously standing on, we take damage. This makes characters like Monk, Arya, and of course Coda an absolute nightmare. It also makes characters that aren't really that bad, like Mary, considerably more difficult. Next is hard mode. This makes it so there's too many bosses in each floor you need to kill instead of one. And there will be too many bosses on each main boss floor as well. But that's not it. Every floor in the whole game gets several sarcophaguses that spawn enemies endlessly, and trapdoors that can normally be used as shortcuts to the next level will just never spawn. Facing mode will just let you walk through walls. This is generally a really big advantage, especially in characters like Monk, Coda, and Dove, so we will keep this turned off. Randomizer randomizes every single thing about enemies. This includes, of course, how much health they have and how much damage they deal, but it also includes things like if the enemy can fly or not, if the enemy can phase through blocks or not. But more crucially, it includes how many beats pass between each action they take. So you could, for example, get golems that instead of jumping once every 4 beats, jump every single beat. In some mobs, it also affects how they behave. For example, you might get a bat that chases you instead of just moving around randomly. This all means that you could get a level full of enemies that have a ton of health, one-shot you, and move erratically and incredibly fast. This shrine probably means that even if you were superhuman, some levels in this game are just literally not possible to clear, which adds an immense amount of RNG to this already RNG heavy challenge, making very RNG reliant characters like of course Arya and Coda, but more importantly Dove, just a nightmare to deal with. Mystery mode changes every single enemy and item in the game into a question mark. So you never really know what you're fighting. I don't really know how much this matters on this run though, since randomizer is already on, and therefore every enemy pretty much behaves in whatever way RNG has deemed suitable. I'm not 100% sure if it's harder for this to be off and see enemies you fought for hundreds and thousands of hours behave in very unexpected ways, or have this on and not have any single clue what any enemy is or what it might do. I think having it on is probably much worse, because certain things don't get randomized, like the armadillos, they always rush towards you when you enter line of sight, or blade masters that always parry your first melee attack and then counterattack. I think seeing enemies you're really used to behave erratically is something you can get better at over time. But the lack of information on what you're fighting will lead you to have to make thousands of little guesses in less than half a second throughout a single run, and you would have to get every single one of them right to come out on top. That seems a lot worse to me. No beat mode makes it so you can move freely. regardless of the beat. This makes the game a lot easier, and we will, of course, keep it turned off. And double tempo, well, doubles the game speed. And yes, this does stack with Bolt and Coda, which means they both play the game at 4 times speed. That is the fastest I can press the button, by the way. I can't even showcase this with Coda, since I'm not even good enough to beat the game with Monk or Arya, let alone unlock Coda. Plus, on Coda, missing a beat would kill me, so I would probably just instantly die. Character lock and friendly fire are multiplayer modifiers, so we won't be touching those. And our last shrine is low percent. This is the mode I covered earlier in the video. Basically, if you pick up any items or interact with anything, you instantly die. This means no healing or bombs or any extra health on any character besides your starting loadout. And there we have it, the hardest challenge in the history of video games. But what would a Coda all shrines run look like? Well, thanks to Obidong, we know that. Of course, he hasn't beaten this, don't be silly. No one has ever come close to beating this. But he did make a task of it. For anyone unfamiliar with speedrunning terms, a task is a tool-assisted speedrun. This basically means he used a program that allows him to move the game frame by frame and choose every single input carefully and with as much time as he wanted, then play it back at full speed. And that looks like this. Yeah, remember that fastest song in the game? This is what that looks like. I really recommend checking the full run down in the link in the description. It is less than 3 minutes long and it is worth every single second. Is it harder to pull this off in an all characters amplified run or just with Coda? At this point, we're talking such absurd levels of difficulty that it is really hard to say. I talked to Obidong and he said a couple things that were really illuminating, like even if double tempo was not enabled and actually swapped for no beat instead, this would still be absolutely impossible. Now remember, no beat means that you would get all the time you could possibly want to make your next move. You could calculate every possible enemy move and analyze every possibility to accurately calculate which move would give you the best odds of surviving. When he says this, what he means is if you don't have the ability to mess up and die to then redo your moves with more information than before, then this is impossible. That means he thinks that even if you were to plot every single possibility, every possible monster and pattern, and then made every single one of your moves as a calculated choice, that the odds of clearing this are still so astronomical that it will never happen. Some levels and bosses have very few actually solvable seeds, and the ones that are solvable have incredibly few solutions. We could get deeper into what this means, but for the sake of length, we won't do that now. He also told me that as far as he's concerned, the human limit should be at 3 modifiers Coda, and that maybe if someone someday achieved double tempo Coda, it could be a bit higher than that. And while this is so ridiculously far-fetched, I wouldn't even begin attempting it. I've seen people clear too many challenges thought to be impossible before to be able to say this will definitely never be beaten. Hell, when I first wrote this script over a year ago, Hades 64 Heat was thought to just be impossible to do in a normal run. Maybe if someone extremely talented, born specifically for this, dedicates years of their life practicing specifically to beat this challenge. Maybe then we will someday see this challenge cleared. But until then, this challenge will remain unbeatable, mocking us, standing on the edge of human capability, and at least for now, will be the unreachable crown jewel of gaming. No matter who you are, no matter how good, no matter what your previous achievements are, or how dedicated, this is out of your reach. And it will remain the hardest game to complete in the history of video games, at least until something harder comes along.
Color-coded just to keep